Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Subscribe today at raneworldview.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for joining us. Colombia has elected its first leftist president in decades. Gustavo Petro's victory came a little more than a year after mass anti-government protests swept the country. What might change? Carmen Colosi has answers. She's RANE's Latin America analyst. Welcome back to the podcast, Carmen.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
It's always great to have you here. Let me ask you this. Colombia is known for decades of really right-wing governments. What possibly brought around this change to electing Petro?
That's a great question. So, in the past Duque administration, we've seen these large protest movements that have really served as political activation for groups of campesinos, social movements, civil organizations, other kind of smaller activist groups, and, obviously all conjoining around the National Strike Committee. So these two protest movements in 2019 and 2021 have really been the catalyst for political activation. So what that has meant is that in Colombia, there's been a really large push against the kind of political elite and the economic elite that have led the country for such a long time. So among this anti-incumbent environment, we've seen, the two runoff candidates were Gustavo Petro, who was a kind of leftist traditional opposition candidate, and the second one was a very anti-establishment candidate, Rodolfo Hernandez, and he was really a catalyst of a bunch of different trends. He had a great media presence, and he was really able to kind of catalyze this younger vote. Ultimately, Colombia elected Petro, which was really kind of reflective of the, social movements that we saw in 2019 and 2021.
So, Carmen, I understand that Petro campaigned on a reformist platform, but do you think that he'll be able to implement this policy agenda?
In many cases, no. Petro's coalition, the Historic Pact, has the largest number of seats in Congress, but it doesn't have a majority, and it can't really pass legislation on its own. And so in order to pass any sort of meaningful legislation, it will force the coalition to negotiate with the opposition and, likely weaken its own policies in order to garner opposition support. So that is one potential mechanism that the administration can use. So reaching across the aisle and weakening policy. The other mechanism to implement his policy agenda could be issuing a state of emergency. He has already floated the idea of implementing a state of emergency to address nationwide hunger in Colombia. And that would allow him to, enact temporary policies, with expanded executive powers. A reason why he might not want to do this is that it could draw unwanted attention from the United States, specifically as the US President, Joe Biden, has really pushed to strengthen democracy across the Western Hemisphere. That could be one reason why he might not want to go and, implement a state of emergency. But it is always a risk in Colombia. So either way, he's going to be able to implement policy through presidential powers and things like that, but it depends on to what extent will he be able to implement such a policy.
If we could just talk a little bit about Colombia's relationship with the United States. Colombia has historically been an ally of the United States. Would that change under this new leftist government?
Under the Biden administration, we're not likely to see that change too much. So Biden has really prioritized Colombia and relations with the country, especially as we've seen other countries in South America have stronger ties with China. Colombia has really been an outlier in that it hasn't had so much outreach and integration with China as other countries in South America. The Biden administration would really like to keep it that way. So we've already seen a call between the president-elect in Colombia, Petro, and US President Biden. The call went well. And they said that they are excited for continued friendly relations. The question that we are thinking about here at RANE is if the leftist president in Colombia breaks this kind of bipartisan support in the US Congress for Colombia. What do I mean by that? So the US Congress has continually implemented economic aid, social aid, aid for dealing with high migration flows towards Colombia due to this, friendly relationship between the two countries. So if the new president in Colombia becomes a polarizing factor in the US Congress, so potentially we could see a progressive, member of Congress or coalition in Congress laud Petro, and we could see, Republicans on the other side of the aisle start to question some policies. That could really break this bipartisan support for Colombia in Congress, which could lead to decreased aid levels. And also another question that we are kind of considering here is if the Republicans take the White House in 2 years in 2024, what would a relationship between a leftist Colombian government look like versus a more conservative or right-leaning administration in the United States? That to us seems like a scenario in which we could see this kind of historic allyship between the United States and Colombia start to dwindle, especially as these kind of ideological concerns become more and more present.
Carmen Colosi is RANE's Latin America analyst. You can read her analysis in RANE Worldview, which offers objective geopolitical analysis and intelligence covering the global landscape. Subscribe today at raneworldview.com. That's RANE worldview.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.